to do with oil. That, yes, supply diversity to a certain extent was part of the strategic plan, but in general, this was much more about a new vision thing, a new way to ensure that the U.S. would be global superpower. Unfortunately for the U.S. right now, and this is becoming a very big issue very quickly, is that oil is key to the new Iraq. And there are two major challenges there. One, that the U.S. will very quickly, because it manages the sector right now, have to minimize short-term production losses while maintaining a reasonable, safe operating environment. Secondly, it will have to, whatever the tactics of the U.S. administration, create an environment, both political, administrative, and of course legal, that will allow a very rapid conclusion of negotiations for investment in new capacity if it wants to lead to rising capacity for, and both are absolutely needed, to stabilize the economic situation in Iraq and then to set it on a new growth path. Now that's all very well. The second bullet especially is leading to a bunch of contradictions. Number one, basically the US needs a UN-recognized system, government in Iraq, which then leads to an oil for food program, and we'll get to that in a second, and then to oil negotiations and oil deals that will lead to an expansion of production in Iraq, oil deals with the oil companies outside. On the other side, it needs a UN-recognized government for the IMF process to kick in so that you can set and train reschedulings, reparations, decide on how much reparations Iraq will have to pay. So this is in itself going to be a complicated process for a while. Now, the battle over the UN role also will be very much at the center of just getting the oil started. And there are already 3 different routes that have been placed, and I won't go into the great details of this, but you can see that a lot of proposals have already been placed forward, and I think that that will, in itself, will take time. Our geologists in our company, and I am not competent to defend this graph, but I think, but from what even the most optimistic view out there is that it would take within 12 to 18 months for the whole negotiation process, if you got a government today that was legitimate to negotiate with, for oil production to start rising. So to a certain extent, this makes OPEC feel a little bit better when they hear this. However, if you look at OPEC, the call on OPEC starting now, and then it's already, you look at the blue part, OPEC 9 minus Iraq is already have to fall, as now that Venezuela is coming back, all right, and that Iraq production comes back. There is, and you already saw this at the latest OPEC meeting, a lot of pressure on OPEC to start cutting back and in an attempt to manage the market. If you look forward, going forward, given weak global demand because of the global recession, in a sense, a slower economic growth, you basically have Iraq and non-OPEC growth accounting for much of the demand out there. So OPEC faces a situation where its members are constrained to a particular flat amount of output for pretty much the next 3 to 4 years. That would be all very well if they were all up to full capacity and the Saudis had some excess capacity. But what we're seeing is a period, because of private investment that has gone into OPEC countries during the last few years and, well, since the mid-90s, that OPEC oil capacity is rising. And that in fact, by about 2007, 2008, we could have excess capacity of around 8 to 10 million barrels a day within the organization. And that has already started to play where Libya, Algeria, Nigeria to a certain extent are saying to Saudi Arabia, and it's in the back rooms now, but I suspect that it'll come out and out even more out of the closet in the early part of 2004. As Iraqi output ramps up, the discussion will be, look, Saudi Arabia, you took the share of Iraq in 1990 when they went offline. Now it's time to give it back. And so the Saudis will be again forced back into a situation where they have to cut below, let's say, 7 million barrels a day to keep prices at, say, $22, $23 a barrel. That is a very key question. Will they do that? Now, there's a debate raging. We've been part of this debate, and that is, why should they do that? In fact, what they should do is trash the price and do what they learned in 1998, that when they did that, it put about 2 million barrels a day of non-OPEC, high-cost, mature area production offline, and then they sailed back with stronger demand and took over that market share. That's the rational thing for an organization like OPEC to do. You tell me, well, I think you're a bit crazy, you don't know the finances of these countries. Can Saudi Arabia and Iran stand $15 oil prices for 2 years, which is sort of what it may take to run some of this production offline? Why Iran? Because that is still a very critical relationship for security reasons. I argue that to a certain extent, Saudi Arabia itself can take it, can take 2 years of low oil prices despite a fairly heavy cost to it. If it thinks strategically, it will run, and I put in $15 into my macro model of Saudi Arabia, and I got a huge current account deficit, something like $25 billion a year. But with access to some level of borrowing, foreign borrowing, and some other means of attracting capital back, which it has been for geopolitical reasons, it could lead to a decline in its foreign assets, and this is the red line, of about, let's say, $25 billion. Now, if you notice, from the dark days of the mid-90s and 98 also, it's built up its reserves by about $55 billion. What if it pursues a strategy where it, every 2 years, trashes the oil price, every 4 years trashes the oil price for 2 years, and in that way keeps control over a certain market share or a slightly growing market share for itself? To a certain extent, it can do that with these type of numbers and these type of resources. Can Iran? I just want to show you this one graph, and that is the surprising change in Iran's fortunes since 1998. Look at the red line. Its assets, foreign assets, have gone from $1 billion to $25 billion in a very short period of time. And because of its access to EU credits and to other market borrowings, to the bond market, it's done $1.5 billion in the last 2 years in borrowings. It can fund its current account deficits and, in fact, maintain its external assets where they are. Its foreign debt will grow, but to a certain extent, it uses that for development projects. If these countries want to do that, they can recreate a low-price environment, which makes it even more difficult for non-OPEC. And that is a possibility. How will the U.S., in a sense, react to this? This is an intriguing new question to me because of the fact that the U.S. is now in Iraq. In the old days, I mean, the U.S. always had a certain schizophrenic policy towards oil prices. Not too low, not too high. In a sense, was a balanced view. You can never say that the US always wanted low prices, as you well know in Texas. But now it intensifies even more, because this time the US has a stake in redeveloping Iraq in the next few years, both from a political and economic point of view. So it needs a particular price. That, in my opinion, directly contradicts what some in the administration had started to talk about after 2001, after 9/11, when they said there are 1,000 Osama bin Laden sitting in Riyadh, and we should go to war with Iraq to create new oil supplies, to trash Iran, to trash Saudi Arabia, and bring those regimes down. Suddenly, the situation becomes quite ambiguous again. And that, I think, may be a check. The need to keep prices at a moderate, and the need of Saudi Arabia to show that it is responsible and still wants to be a strategic partner of the United States, it may stop this from happening, where it trashes it, pursues this 2-year on or 4-year off price policy. There's one, I think, again, still a major wild card, and I would just concentrate on the whole perception in the Middle East that there's a neocon agenda out there, and that there is a group in the administration that is almost most forceful and most visible, that they want to create a new Middle East and in the US's own image, and that is really threatening to both Iran and Saudi Arabia and Syria, of course. Now, to deal with that, I think you will go, the baseline means that these three countries will deal with that, is to go back and solidify the Riyadh Entente, of trying to work together to shore up among themselves good relations, that they don't get sucked into the vortex of Iraq, and in a sense expose themselves to the wrath of the US. That is the one, I think that's the baseline outlook there, and we've just started to think about that because it's fairly recent days. But what if, and this is again very preliminary thoughts, what if something else happens, and that's the last, that the US is grossly unsuccessful in Iraq, and that a very strong Shia regime comes to power, and that Shia regime is very much tied to Iran. I suspect that that will really destabilize the Riyadh Entente, because it will make Iran, and what if Iran extends itself in a moment of enthusiasm, let's say, and says, now we've got these two strong countries in the Gulf. I think that will change the stance of Saudi Arabia. And at that point, and I don't know what particular year that would be, that we could go back to having, back to the relations of the 1980s, where Iran and Saudi Arabia were at loggerheads over Iraq, and that could be back to a very unstable oil markets, sort of similar to what happened from 86 to 96, for example. Anyway, this is early days, and I just wanted to throw that out. Changing tack a little bit, I want to go to a issue of the oil companies, and many of you have seen these, but this is the basically R/P ratios, where an Exxon with a lot of reserves and a lot of production is way off in the corner with Shell, and this is the spread. And we've sort of, in our typical consultants way, put circles around them and colored the graph. These are the global competitors, the regional majors, who have some quite strong control, and many of them, as you'll see, are national private companies or national oil companies, and have control over their sectors. And then some of the emerging players that, and interesting new players that came out in the 90s. Anyhow, the point here is that many of the big companies are have created core areas and are in core areas that are reaching maturity. And that to a large extent, their core areas were in the OECD basins, and now that is changing. That is pushing them out of the OECD to other areas. The other issue is that they're creating new, in a sense, moving from oil cores to trying to develop their gas resources, which we heard earlier at one time were considered to be marginal fuel. The problem for them is that, well, I just show you this graph, and this is the percentage of their upstream income from North America and Europe, their OECD cores, and that is pushing them to move outside. The problem for them is this is what they face on a political level in terms of control of oil, that the largest part is controlled by national oil companies or governments, and so that they do not have access. And this, I think, will be one of the real challenges, as much as possibly the resource challenge, is finding a way to get governments to open up. Now, the one piece of good news for companies, in my opinion, is that if OPEC loses control over oil prices in the near to medium term, and if Matt Simmons' talk of falling resources is true in many countries, then you've got governments that are desperate, especially outside of the core Gulf, that will decide that we can't keep up this. I mean, our national incomes are falling so rapidly. And that, I think, creates new access, and not in a smooth way, not in the idealistic way that we thought in the early 1990s, but most certainly it re-greases the wheels to foreign investment coming in. But also that brings with it, in my opinion, and I'll get back to this. Well, actually, let me just deal with this really quickly. One of the things that, as we categorized that oil in the big part of the cheese wedge, was that it was closed and controlled by national oil companies. I think that is a little bit of a mistaken way of looking at it. There's a lot more nuance there, and that's why I think there's a lot more opportunities for international oil companies in these countries. Yes, certain NOCs and national oil companies have gained greater prowess and are developing their own oil resources and starting to ramp up their skill levels and even going overseas and competing. But in many cases, and this is particularly true in Venezuela, potentially in Brazil, potentially in Saudi Arabia, that the NOC is a threat to its leadership, especially the new forces, the populist left governments coming to power, and when the NOC's leadership are from, in a sense, a different class, and are in opposition, and in Venezuela's case, try to bring the government down. Now, in fact, in my opinion, most IOCs have missed the point of Venezuela, and even missed the point of Saudi Arabia. They went and still started to talk to the NOC, thinking that the NOC was the blockage, that they could seduce the NOC, and forgot about, in many ways, the government. And the real customer for the IOCs was the government. And therefore, developing a strategy to deal with these governments is extremely important. The old left suspicion of international oil companies, I think, has dissipated. They have not anymore got this image out there that they are overthrowing governments a la Shah of Iran and all of Mossadegh, not Shah of Iran. Anyway, but I think it is critical for them, and this is what complicates, and this is what makes it slow, is to understand where the state is going. And to a certain extent, again, please pardon the typical consultant boxes, but I think this is a useful chart in that where the state moves is how it chooses the NOC and how it chooses the IOC role. There are specific pairings between what type of NOCs are tolerated by what type of state. And I think it is understanding that issue over the next few years that will be critical. I think some of the larger companies will understand it. Some of the smaller companies, and I think that some of the larger companies will have the time and resources to wait it out and to understand. Some of the smaller companies, it may be more difficult, but I think this is very critical to understanding future access. We have a system of assessing risk in PFC. It's called a Petroleum Risk Manager. This is a static chart, but it is nonetheless does tell you that we still think that there's a lot of risk out there, political, economic, entry risk as we assess it, and operating risk for companies. That, to a certain extent, if the prices fall, the political and economic risk may increase, but the access risk may dissipate and fall. So there's an interesting thing that, as I always say, when the banks leave, the oil companies are walking into producing countries because that's when they really need the money. And so I think that this chart could change quite dramatically over the next few years to where there's less yellow and more purple and blue on it as countries start to get more desperate if oil prices are weaker. I think this has already been said very well by the previous speaker, and I'll stop here, but just that natural gas supply is a pressing issue, and I have some more slides on that, but I won't pursue that and end here with the point that I think geopolitics is still going to be very much in play over the next decade. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Iraq is a huge issue, and how that sector pans out. Saudi Arabia's quest to be still in control over the oil markets, and then, of course, how foreign companies deal with risk issues and how they gain access to different countries, which are opening up at different paces. I'll end there.
Well, great. I think we have a couple minutes for a few questions, if we have some questions. And Matt, are you willing to take a couple questions? So we could do a few questions for either Fareed or Matt and still get Mr. Rifkin here at the moment we need him so that he can catch his plane ride. So I open up the floor to questions.
As I asked another speaker, I just want to know how I could contact you and get a copy of your presentation, because unfortunately...
Can I just say all of these presentations are going to be up on the Baker Institute website with a link to the CNST website, and I'm sure all the speakers will have their email on the slides, so that'll take care of that.
Thanks.
Thank you.
For Fareed, I'm curious as to how the Iranians, it's a minor question, but I'm curious as to how the Iranians adjusted their balance between external assets and liabilities so quickly. I'd like to apply that technique to my personal finances.
I'll go to the IMF. Basically, I think the leadership in Iran from 92 onwards, because the U.S. interfered with the Paris Club process, where, they went into very steep debt. They got into the debt trap, basically, after they opened up their economy a little bit after the austerity of the 80s. And they borrowed $25 billion in 2 years. And there was a considerable amount of corruption involved with the bonyads, the foundations. Anyway, they went then to the Paris Club, the bilateral creditors organization, which the U.S. is part of. And the U.S. said, no, you're not going to get bilateral terms. In fact, we're not even going to deal with you. And that's when Clinton first came to power. And so the Europeans independently negotiated with the Iranians. And that finally caught the attention of the Iranian leadership. Khomeini had always said that economics was for donkeys. And as an economist, I had personal problems with that. But the leadership in Iran started to say, hey, this is a national security issue. And so they ran very large surpluses, even in a fairly low price environment. They cut imports from 25 billion to 12 billion in a year. And they ran that basically through to 2001. and basically repaid the debt. It's $7 billion now. And they just ran up foreign assets, and high oil prices were very critical to that. And that's part of why they went to the Saudis. And that's also part of why they went and opened up the buyback arrangements where foreign oil companies could come in and invest in that sector.
Matt, you paint a pretty pessimistic picture. What do you think the solution is to some of the issues that you raise? I mean, you know, it's world oil economy and certainly regional gas economies, and you're not projecting much of a future in either of those.
Well, you know, first of all, I'm inherently an optimistic person, But what I find astonishing when I think about U.S. natural gas, because it's a lot easier to think about U.S. natural gas than it is global oil, is I got heavily involved in 99, late 98, 99, working on the MPC study for the outlook for natural gas. And by the end of 99, when I finally came to the just devastating conclusion, I said, what's all this mean? That we basically had effectively linked the entire future of the United States economy to a presumption that we had bountiful amount of natural gas. We hadn't paid any attention to the fact that supply hadn't grown at all. We weren't capturing decline curves. And what was interesting was that as I kept raising these issues amongst the people at the NPC, we were all working feverishly together, people saying, why are you being so bullish? Or why are you being so bearish? And at one point, there was in our last wrap-up meeting, within an hour, I got accused of being both. And my response was, you know, I'm just trying to analyze. And I walked away from that exercise, and I said, you know, it's actually mind-boggling that here we are in the United States of America, the most open society, the best amount of information, the most communicative and so forth. And just like in oil, you know, this funny story about 1956 and Dr. Hubbard saying in the early 70s, I think the U.S. is going to peak, and people said, what a crackpot. And as I've gone back and read the history of that, what's amazing is that by 1970, his reputation was totally in the gutter. And one of the reasons people jumped all over him was said, we've never produced more the year we peaked. And I think 30 years later, we didn't learn anything about natural gas. And I thought it was pretty obvious. But then we had the gas drilling boom. You know, if we're ever going to have a supply increase, it's going to come now. And so I look at how blindsided we got in the United States. And you know what's bad about the U.S. natural gas deal? We didn't create a backdoor. There was not a contingency plan. Of what happens if natural gas supply doesn't grow. Well, you know what? It's not going to grow. It's not going to stay flat. It's going to decline. And unfortunately, we're going to pay a wicked price for doing this. What I worry about the global oil is, gosh, I hope I'm wrong. But I think there's some issues in global oil that are reminiscent of what we missed. And again, it's not running out. It's the unbelievable implications of peaking when you basically haven't prepared for it, because there isn't any trapdoor. And I find it a relatively depressing outlook, inherently, and particularly since I'm a relatively optimistic person.
Can we take one more question?
Yeah, we haven't heard anything yet. Maybe we will about coal, and maybe because the transition to coal, which can of course be used to gasification of coal, and liquefaction is another source, and it's one that in the 70s the Carter administration actually started to look into. We haven't heard anything about that. Now we would have this additional aspect of sequestration because of global warming. But you know, when people are talking about what are we going to do about this, you know, all of our oil is under their desert, and you know this could cause problems. Would you, either of the speakers want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I think coal has an enormously important role. As some of you know, I spent the third week in February in China on a program, Clean Air for Asia, with the Chinese government, the Indian government, the Japanese government, the U.S. government, and whether you like coal or not, coal is an anchor resource, and particularly if it turns out we're peaking in oil and natural gas, then we're going to have to really rely on coal. There are two problems with coal. Coal's dirty, and it's unbelievably energy inefficient. So you just have to consume unbelievable amounts of energy to turn inert coal into usable energy. But we better basically spend all of the research and knowledge we know how to try to figure out the two problems with coal. Make it as clean as possible, make sure that we understand where coal bed methane is and where it isn't, so forth, and try some way to figure out how to make it more energy efficient. But to ignore coal is really a bad mistake.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to thank the speakers. Our next speaker may be known to many of you. I'm sure many of you have read some of his books. Jeremy Rifkin is the president of the Foundation of Economic Trends and the author of too many books for me to list today. He has been very influential in shaping public policy, not only in the United States, but in the international community. Among his 14 books, they've dealt with scientific and technological changes in the economy, workforce, society, and the environment. At the end of his presentation today, he will be out in the back during our coffee break with his recent works, The End of Work, and the Biotech Century, Harnessing the Gene and Remaking the World. And so it's really a pleasure to introduce to you Jeremy Rifkin.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for sticking around. The really great economic revolutions in history, the really great ones, they occur when two things happen. A basic change in the way we human beings organize the energy reserves of the planet, combined with a basic change in the way we communicate with each other to organize the new energy regimes. The convergence of energy and communications are the pivotal points in world history. They're very infrequent. But when they happen, they change the dynamics for civilizations for years and centuries to come. I'll give you an example. Ancient Iraq, first great agricultural civilization at Sumeria. They took the sun's energy, they found a way to capture it in cereal plants. The stored grain became the prime mover for civilization for 10,000 years, the cereal civilizations. But when they went to agriculture, it was a more complex way of managing the energy of the environment. It required sophisticated hydraulics and irrigation, planting and storage. And it also meant that they needed a new command and control mechanism to organize it. It was called cuneiform, writing. The coming together of writing with agriculture was one of the pivotal points in world history. 10,000 years. Skip up to the early modern era. Gutenberg reinvents the print press. The Chinese already had it. But for 3 centuries, this communication medium, although it was revolutionary, had absolutely no economic mission. It had a social mission. They began mass producing the Bible in vernacular in Northern Europe. Each person could bear witness to the coming of the kingdom. They didn't need the Vatican and the priesthood as intermediaries, and we started to see a great schism in Christianity. The Protestant Reformation was the result. It changed European history. But the economic mission of the print press really didn't become clear until James Watt patented that steam engine at the dawn of the American Revolution. We went to coal and steam power. We dug up the burial grounds of the Jurassic Age. We had a new source of stored energy for civilization. When we went to coal and steam power, we quickened the pace, the speed, the flow, the connectivity, and the density of human exchange. And economic activity, qualitative changes in economic activity are all about the change in density of exchange. And density exchange is all about new energy sources. So when we went to coal and steam, we quickened the pace, we quickened the density of exchange. This new sophistication required a new command and control mechanism called print. You could not possibly have organized the first industrial revolution with codex from the monastery. Too slow. The telegraph and telephone preceded the internal combustion engine by a handful of years. Actually, telegraph was much earlier. They became the command and control mechanism for oil in the internal combustion engine. We needed a communication vehicle that was agile and in a flow capacity that could then efficiently organize the internal combustion engine oil capacity. Second industrial revolution. Here's why I mention this. We've had a great communication revolution in the 1990s. Digital technology, personal computers, the World Wide Web, the telecommunication revolution. Yes, we connected the central nervous system of 1 billion human beings with each other at the speed of light. No small feat. We can now exchange information in nano and picoseconds, below the realm of perception. That's a turning point in and of itself. Yes, we increased productivity at the workplace by 1.5%, 2%. Actually, last year, 4.5% rise in productivity in the U.S. Parenthetically, this was the greatest rise in productivity since 1950. The same year, we let 1 million people go. When I mean go, I mean go. No longer counted as unemployed, discouraged workers. They've left the workforce. And just to spend a second on that, I wrote a book called The End of Work a few years ago. I think we should bring that back out this year because the analysis I had was that the new technologies may not follow the same lead as the old technologies. We used to believe in the economics profession that new technology revolutions are disruptive. They increase productivity. You lose old jobs, but you create new opportunities. We may be on the cusp of a different bell curve now. These technologies we're introducing in the 21st century are so intelligent, so smart, and so cheap that the cheapest work in the world may not be as cheap as the smart technology that could replace them from factory floor to professional suite in the 21st century. I don't know of a CEO I work with that believes in the 22nd century we're going to need mass human labor to produce goods and services in this world. Do you? No. So our real unemployment, University of Chicago study this year, 10%, and it was throughout the entire decade. We lost several million people from the workforce and just didn't count them. But here we had a new communication revolution. We quickened the pace. We connected 1 billion people. We increased productivity. But all of those dot-com companies, silly. I teach at Wharton School. I've been there a long, long time in the executive and advanced management program. And we brought in business leaders in the 90s, and they were talking to me about their little dot-com projects, and I just sat there in silence when I rolled my eyes. What do these things do? The problem here with this communication revolution, we didn't understand its anthropology. So we put together a lot of toys, hoping to find some way to leverage it. Most of them came and went. What's going to become clear to the investment community in the next year? We're about to see a great convergence, pivotal point in history. And that is the decentralized worldwide communication system that we created in the 1990s is going to become the command and control mechanism for distributive, decentralized hydrogen energy, the new energy regime of the 21st century. And the bridge to both of these disciplines will be the nanotechnologies that you're talking about here in this room in the last 2 days, for the material, the development, the infrastructure. Well, here's what I mean by this. When you get your fuel cell, it will be analogous to a personal computer. You have to imagine thousands and millions of people with their fuel cells. Their automobiles are fuel cells, their industrial parks are fuel cells, their homes are fuel cells. Then they take the electricity and they use it. They generate their own content, decentralized, just like communications. But there's going to be excess electricity you don't need. You're going to send it back to the power grid here in Texas and around the country. But the power grid has to be reconfigured. The role of the HPs, I noticed someone was here from HP. I was with HP's Pacific division in Los Angeles last November. I think HP controls 65% of the hardware on the grid. What I said to HP is, here's your role, HP, Microsoft, etc. You're going to reconfigure every power grid in the world so it's smart, decentralized, digitalized, so that when you send electricity to the grid, you can send it peer-to-peer in real time to whoever you choose to send it to on the grid. The coming together of decentralized communication as the command and control mechanism for bottom-up distributive generation of hydrogen, with the nanotechnologies providing the material scaffolding, that's the 21st century. That is the third industrial revolution. It will be as powerful in its impact as the coming together of print, coal, and rail in the 19th century, multiplier effect, the entire 19th century, first industrial revolution. The coming together of decentralized communication, nanotechnologies, and distributive generation of hydrogen will be as powerful in the 21st century as the coming together of telegraph, telephone, electrification with the internal combustion engine and oil, the multiplier effect, the entire 20th century. Are there difficulties in front of us? Absolutely. The technology is expensive. There are so many scientific and technical problems that haven't been worked out. The politics is a mess. The investment capital is not yet focused. This is a disruptive revolution on the scale of a great economic change in history. But so what? That's what the case was with coal, steam, and rail. That was the case with the internal combustion engine, oil, and roads in the 20th century. This is the 21st century. This is the revolution in front of us. That's why you're meeting here. And you're trying to find what are the connections between nanotechnology, communication, and new energy regimes. Let me back up for a moment. It is all about oil. The 20th century has always been about oil. We grow our food in petrochemical fertilizers and pesticides. Our clothes are primarily made out of petrochemical synthetics. Our packaging and plastics and building materials are made out of petrochemicals. Our pharmaceutical products are derived from petrochemicals. Our power, our heat, our light, it goes on and on. We live in an oil age. We have had great benefits. We have enjoyed tremendous leap forward from digging up the burial grounds of the Jurassic and other eras in history. We have. When I mean we, some of us in part of the world. This hasn't been an energy revolution that has been distributed broadly, but we've had great benefits in the North and in the West. But now we're facing three crises. They're all big ones, and they're all directly connected to oil and the benefits of the oil era. First crisis is global warming. Global warming is the dark side of the industrial age. It's the entropy bill for 200 years of using that stored sun. Some of you may have had to suffer through a book I wrote about a quarter of a century ago called Entropy. I tried to convince my colleagues in the economics community that they had it all wrong. You engineers will appreciate and get a laugh out of this. Because, you know, all the economists base economic theory on Newton's mechanics. The great scientist, mathematician of the 20th century, Alfred North Whitehead, once mused with his students about Newtonian mechanics. He said, well, Newtonian mechanics tells you how fast something's going and where it's located. Other than that, there's not much more of interest to be said on the subject. But every engineer in this room understands that economic activity is really about the thermodynamics of energy conversion. Economic activity is about how we use up energy. So our economists have a term, externalities. That's the entropy bill. Every engineer understands it. We ought to bring the engineers in to re-educate the economists. So, the bottom line here, global warming, we've doubled the CO2 content in less than a century. And I should say that the public has not really cared about this issue of global warming until this year. It's been a policy issue, it's been a regulatory concern, but not a public issue until this year. And here's what's happened. I spend half of my month each month in Europe. I'm a long-distance commuter. And all my European friends, and you probably have had this in Europe if you visited there this year, they're all talking about the floods. 3 years of record floods. This year, from Dresden to Milan, flooding every year. And they're beginning to ask, does this have anything to do with climate change? No one knows. May be coincidental. But they're beginning to talk in the salons and in the homes, what's going on with the weather conditions in Europe. They're really severe. Here in North America, the public became concerned this year because we are starting to experience record drought in the east. And then we turn on the TV every night, and it was painful watching those fires, the forest ablaze across the western range night after night after night. In Southeast Asia, they have something called the brown cloud. It hasn't gotten much attention here in the States, but this brown cloud is passing the subcontinent, 100,000 people dead from respiratory diseases. They're projecting 200,000 more deaths and a 10% decline in agricultural yield. So the public's beginning to say, what's going on with this radical change in weather patterns? The UN climate report, I read it. It's thousands of pages. It took 15 years. We brought together all the best scientists in the world, the national academies. They issued their report 2 years ago. They're saying, look, we're going to see more severe weather changes. We're going to see wildfires. We're seeing them. We're going to see drought. We're seeing them. They said we're going to see much more severe hurricanes. We're seeing them. Coastal damage. We're seeing it. Then they began to say we're going to see the snow melt on the great ice caps from the Himalayas to the Andes. We're seeing it. They said we're going to see the great ice packs off the Arctic come out into the sea, and we may have a ice-free sea up there by 2050. We're beginning to see all of these telltale signs. They could all be coincidental. When I first started writing about global warming and entropy in 1980, we didn't have much data. We have a lot more data. Is it conclusive? No. But as you as scientists know, nothing's ever conclusive. But any good scientist worth their mettle ought to begin to believe, and we do, something's wrong here. They're projecting somewhere between a 2.5 and 10 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature. If it's the low range, it's going to be serious. If it's at the high range, it's going to be catastrophic. Remember, 9 degrees separates us from the last ice age. And we are under thousands of feet of ice in the northern hemisphere just 15,000 years ago. The best way to understand the enormity of this, I saw a study, you may have seen it, that was published in the journal Science on Yellowstone National Park. They projected that the temperature range in Yellowstone, this was several years ago, will have migrated way up into British Columbia in 30 years from now. The trees simply can't migrate fast enough to keep up with that temperature range. So the trees die. But their habitat for all the species in Yellowstone, they die. Then you magnify that toward every ecosystem in the world that has to adjust in a moment of time, less than a century, to an epic change in the biochemistry of the planet. The National Academy of Sciences put out a study last year, which everybody ignored. I don't know if you saw it. They said, you know what? We're expecting that the temperature is going to rise in an evolutionary way a couple of degrees each year for the next century. Time to adjust, which is still a small period of time. The Academy said that's actually not the way it's worked if we look back at the geological record. What we see is a great threshold shift in chemistry and in temperature in a short time period. For example, the National Academy of Sciences went back and looked at the Younger Dryas level between the last ice age and today, and what did they see? 1/3 of all the temperature change that we've had in the last 15,000 years occurred in less than 10 years. There was a threshold shift in the chemistry. If you were to measure human accomplishments to date in terms of sheer impact, unfortunately, we'd have to say that global warming may be the most powerful accomplishment of the human race. It's a negative one, but we've affected the chemistry of a planet in the solar system in less than 100 years. Global warming, the oil connection. The second oil connection is obvious, but it's not talked about publicly, and that is the relationship between what's happened with oil in the last 30 years and third world debt. Our young kids take to the streets in Seattle and Washington and Davos and Genoa, and they say, cancel third world debt. Our young kids. Amen. But if we don't understand the cause of the debt, we're going to be right back in it 6 months later. It's connected to oil. You remember, you older folks, oil was trading at $3 a barrel in 1971. Not $3 a barrel, it was a commodity. So all of the economists and the policy people in the 50s and 60s convinced the third world to modernize their economy with oil because it was a commodity. Then OPEC hit. Within 3 months, oil went from $3 to $12 a barrel and never went back down. We all took the hit, but we found oil in the North Sea, and we were able to adjust. But the real hit was the developing countries, not at 12 a barrel. For 30 years, they've been borrowing money from the IMF and the World Bank and lending institutions to pay for oil they can't afford. Today, 83 cents out of every dollar borrowed in the third world is actually being used to pay off their old debt, so they're not even getting the oil. And we got 89 countries worse off today than 10 years ago in real dollars. Oil. Never before in history have so few human beings had so much largesse of the planet and so many human beings been denied basic access. We just don't have any record of this. When we look back at Paleolithic history and Neolithic history and ancient antiquity, medieval Europe and the early modern age, we do not have a divide in terms of survival of our species as we have today. How deep is the divide? I was with Warren Buffett 3 weeks ago. He's the second richest man in the world. And last week I was with Bill Gates Sr., Bill Gates' dad. So I was thinking, and I actually said this with Mr. Buffett, I spared Mr. Gates, the 3 richest men in the world, their assets now equal the annual income of the 950 million poorest people on the planet. It gets worse. The 350 wealthiest people in the world today, you could put them in this room, their assets equal the combined annual income of 40% of humanity. Then we wonder why we have a loss of social trust and volatility and political instability and growing terrorism and illegal migration from south to north and east to west. We have a very troubled planet. Oil's at the center of this. The third crisis is the Middle East. President Bush said that we needed to go into Iraq because Saddam Hussein posed a threat to the national security of our country, that he is harboring terrorists, and that he has weapons of mass destruction. Now, I believe that actually President Bush believes that. I want to be very clear. I believe that he believes that, and that was his motivation. We could argue about whether that was the correct analysis of the situation, especially since we haven't found any of these weapons, but I believe he believes it. On the other hand, as you know, President Bush is not a stupid man. You don't get into the presidency unless you got to be smart. He comes out of the oil industry. Vice President Cheney comes out of the oil industry. Condoleezza Rice comes out of the oil industry. I've lived in Washington 33 years. I've never seen an administration so tied to oil. So what I suspect happened is the motivation was we've got to rid the world of a madman because he's a threat to our security. I believe that's honest. But then they said once we secure the oil fields, we have a plum here. We have to then rethink oil in the Middle East. Maybe we have an antidote to OPEC and the Saudis. We certainly have a new position geopolitically. Does that make sense? To believe, as Mr. Rumsfeld said, that they've never talked about oil all the way up to the attack, how naive do they think we are? It had to be some factor in the discussion. It couldn't have been zero. But this is a very dangerous game being played out there around oil. Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world. On the other hand, the idea that we're going to create a civil society along the terms that we believe is democratic in less than 5 years is a pipe dream. We could bring democracy to Iraq, but it's going to be an Islamic fundamentalist state. It is not going to be a civil society. It takes generations to create a civil society. You can't legislate it into existence. So I think we're in deep trouble in the Middle East. I think, as my wife says, we've won the war, but will we win the peace? And I think everyone here is just as concerned. The problem for the business community is this. I work with CEOs all over the world, and every time we sit down privately, here's what they say to me. They hold their breath on oil prices. Prices are going down right now. But I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where business leaders say, well, I don't know whether I should expand my inventory or hold my inventory. Do I hire or do I fire? Do I put more money in R&D and advance these new product lines, or do I hold because I don't know the price of oil tomorrow? How long can the business community hold its breath? The next 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years? The analysis at 1 o'clock, that hour-long analysis, was the most cogent, probably the best analysis I've seen on the oil and gas picture. Right on the money, as far as we know. So, we've got global warming and the oil crisis. We've got third world debt, the increasing divide between the haves and have-nots in the oil crisis. And now we have the Middle East and the prospect of our young men and women being in harm's way, and at least the geopolitics being of great concern to the world for years and years to come. This would be enough to fill our agenda. I haven't gotten to the bad news yet, so stick with me. Mr. Bad News, as my wife says. There'll be some good news here. It's compounded by a second reality, which was brilliantly laid out at the 1 o'clock talk. We assumed there'd be enough cheap crude so we wouldn't reach peak till around 35 more years. 35 more years we reach peak. Now, peak, as you know, it was explained as a petrogeology term. Peak is when half your known and yet to be discovered reserves of oil are used up. That's only half, but that's when the air is over. That's the top of the bell curve. Everyone here in the industry knows that, because once you're at the top of the bell curve, you go down and your prices go up. So the U.S. Geological Survey, the International Energy Administration, the OECD, the Department of Energy, they say at a 2% growth rate in energy use, we'll peak around 2037. Now, there's other scenarios. There are many other scenarios, but that's a scenario, middle scenario. In the last 3 years, however, a dozen or so of the best geologists in the world, they were on the board there, Dr. Campbell and Lahare and others. These are world-class geologists. They've been re-looking at the numbers. They have new computer studies. And they're saying maybe these numbers are wrong. Maybe we're going to peak by 2010 to 2020. Now, frankly, I don't know who's right. When I wrote The Hydrogen Economy, you'll see Chapter 2. It was a tedious chapter. I was holding my breath during this talk at 1:30 because I wanted to see, did I get it the same way this gentleman did? Yeah, we're pretty much on the same page here. And that is, and when I went back and we interviewed the scientists on both sides, the engineers, who's right, the Cassandras or the optimists? They don't know. It's a lot of guesswork because the numbers are hard to pin down. But then it dawned on me before I put this book out, I was oxing for no reason. It doesn't make any difference who's right here, the pessimists or the optimists. They're only disagreeing by 25 years. Do we peak in 2010 or 2020 or 2030 to 2040? From a geophysical point of view, it's irrelevant, and from a geopolitical point of view, it's virtually irrelevant. What they all agree on, once we peak, 2/3 of all the remaining reserves are in the Persian Gulf. So if we think the Persian Gulf's a hot spot this afternoon, what is it going to be like in 5, 8, 9, 10, 12, 14 years from now? India and China's energy needs will be equal to the G7. Are we all going to be fighting for that oil? Who's going to control it? This is a geopolitical nightmare. So, the energy companies are aware that we're moving toward peak. You're all represented here. There's a lot of interest in making the transition to natural gas. Natural gas emits less CO2. The problem is, and I agree with this analysis that was put up here, natural gas is likely to peak shortly after oil peaks. It's already peaked in the United States, probably going to be peaking in Canada, it's peaked in Mexico. Let me give you another figure, by the way, which you may not know. I was at the APEC Summit, Asian Pacific Summit, the heads of states were there, and we did a plenary. I did a plenary with Mr. Munoz, the head of Pemex, did a plenary together. He's a Vicente Fox appointee. 20 minutes into the talk, he said, I agree with Mr. Rifkin, and then he released studies that no one had heard yet. He said, Pemex internal studies, remember, Mexico's the 4th largest producer of oil in the world. He said, Pemex internal studies say we peak in Mexico in 2010. We net import in 2030. So one businessman said, my God, what does this mean for Mexico? It's 1/3 of our revenue for the government. He said, get used to it. We've got to make a shift into renewables and hydrogen. I was down in Veracruz last month to keynote their oil summit. I met with the ministers. They're beginning to ask, what do we do now so we use the oil we've got in the right way so we can get to where we need to go beyond oil? Just beginning this discussion. That's Pemex, Mexico. So the North Sea peaked last fall. Caspian will probably peak by the end of the decade. While we are, and natural gas is a short-term transition, I should say, I think there's somebody here from the Electric Power Research Institute. Well, it's interesting that we're building 250 gas-fired power plants to take advantage of natural gas, but the Electric Power Research Institute's own figures show that natural gas can't hold the price beyond 2023, 24. And then we still haven't amortized all our natural gas utilities by then. So, let me be clear. The way we may be moving toward peak on oil and gas, there's plenty of fossil fuels left, as we all know. We're not running short of fossil fuels. There is heavy oil in Venezuela, there's tar sand in Canada, and there's a lot of coal in the United States, and there's plenty. The problem is they are dirtier and they emit more CO2, and we didn't factor into the UN studies because we assumed enough cheap crude to mid-century. The studies don't factor in if we have to make a dramatic shift to tar sand, heavy oil, and coal much sooner. So I can't tell you we know what the figures will be because no one's done the numbers. Tar sand is competitive at 12 a barrel. I just finished a 9-city tour with McKinsey where we introduced the hydrogen economy to 6,000 people in the business community, financial community. We have one more city left, Montreal, next week. I was just in Quebec yesterday. And tar sands are competitive at 12 a barrel. But Canada has signed the Kyoto Accords, so they don't know what to do about tar sand. All right? Well, Syncrude is hedging its bets. They've just invested $100 million in renewables. We'll get into this in a moment. So, I believe we're in the last half century where oil is the dominant energy regime. It'll be here throughout the century, but I think we're in the last half century. This is a great energy regime that began with the bringing of coal to Newcastle now dramatically winding down in the oil fields in the Middle East. There is, however, a new energy regime on the horizon. It's immediate. It's at the front gate. The question is, will we open that gate appropriately and get there? And there's no doubt in my mind it's hydrogen. Hydrogen is the basic element of the universe, the lightest element in existence, the stuff of the stars. And when you employ hydrogen for power, the only byproduct is pure water and heat. The astronauts have been drinking that water for 30 years and using fuel cell technology. I notice we have some people here from NASA. I must say I gave a mea culpa talk several months ago at the National Meeting of Research Institutes in Florida, because for years I was one of those guys that said, you know, show me one positive thing NASA's done for the country. Well, I've had to rethink that in the last few years. You know, you get older and you start seeing the telltale signs. Many, many developments in high tech, but if it were only one development, fuel cells, it would be enough. They resurrected the fuel cell. They resurrected it, they put it in a high-tech context, and they opened the door to a new period of history. And that fuel cell development that they engage in will be as important in the 21st century as when Daimler and Benz put out that first internal combustion engine for us. If NASA has done nothing else, that would be a singular enough event to establish its legacy in the 21st century here on Earth. So, hydrogen. The good news is it's ubiquitous, it's the forever fuel, and there's no pollution. The bad news, as every engineer knows here, and it was explained in the talks, it's not free-floating. You have to extract it. Most of the hydrogen we extract today comes from natural gas. You steam out the hydrogen, then we store it for power in a fuel cell. The problem is, if natural gas, as these slides say, peaks after oil a few years later, then we've created an entire infrastructure based on extracting hydrogen from fossil fuels, and that infrastructure will be not relevant. We'll be right back to square one. So yes, we can get hydrogen from natural gas. We could probably try to get hydrogen by gasification of coal, but there's no way yet to sequester the CO2. They're hoping they'll find it. All of that's problematic and keeps us in the fossil fuel arena. There is another way to extract hydrogen. It's more elegant. I believe it's the future, but it's more expensive now. And that is use renewable energy and electrolysis of water, eventually direct sunlight for hydrogen extraction. You take renewable energy, solar photovoltaic, wind, geothermal, hydro and biomass, renewable energy, generate electricity locally. You use the electricity immediately, but there's always surplus. The surplus is used to grab the hydrogen out of the water, like we did in high school chemistry class, and store it for future use. But this is expensive. We're generating electricity twice. There's a thermodynamic bill here. Every engineer knows that. First, you generate the electricity with the renewables for the electrolyzing the water, and then for the power cell. But here's the point. We cannot have a renewable energy society, the kind that so many of the baby boomers here, so many of the engineers and scientists and parents here, you've dreamed of a renewable energy society for your kids, can't have it without hydrogen. You know it, and I know it, and the public's soon going to know it. The reason is renewable energy can't be stored. It's as simple and profound as that. When we generate renewable energy with wind and solar photovoltaic and geothermal and hydro, that electricity flows. We have no way of storing it on a mass scale. So if the wind isn't blowing for a few days and the sun stops shining over the country and there's no hydro because of drought, the electricity stops. That's exactly what happened in Brazil, the 9th largest economy in the world, for the last 3 years. 92% of their electricity is hydroelectric. They had no storage capacity. They had drought. The electricity kept going on and off and on and off. Lo and behold, Lula da Silva becomes the new head of Brazil. Changes the entire political dynamic of the country. Electricity played no small role there. So, hydrogen is not primary, as it's been said here before. It's a storage carrier. And that is, we take some of the electricity we generate with renewables, that we don't use immediately, grab the hydrogen, store it, then we have stored energy like coal, oil, and gas. How do we get there? There are 2 bell curves for every investment counselor in the world today. The bell curve for oil and gas continues to go up. Now, it'll go down. There'll be spurts. It's going down right now. But as we go toward peak, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you have to keep a 25-year frame, it's going to edge up toward peak, the price. The indirect price of oil and gas is already there. They call it an externality. It's actually the entropy bill. We were paying more money before we went into Iraq. We were actually paying more dollars militarily to secure the oil there than the net actual import of the oil coming from the Middle East. And that was before we vested the, $70 billion on the war. And if we have to stay there each year at a cost of 30 or 40 billion, and I think that's really conservative, you start to see the external costs. You start to see the secondary costs. Then there's the cost of global warming. I work with the CEOs of the reinsurance industry, Munich Re, other companies. When we talk about it privately, they don't have a clue as how to model the liability, the entropy bill for global warming. When they look at floods and droughts and wildfire and catastrophic property damage and agricultural yield, what happens is the entropy bill begins to approach the net value of the economic activity that your energy is giving to you. Then you can't model it anymore. This is when you know you're at the end of an energy era. This has happened before in civilizations. Back up for a moment. There's been about 25 or 30 great civilizations, depending on which historian you particularly favor. Great civilizations have come and gone for a lot of reasons. But a number of the great civilizations have collapsed because they depleted their energy regime and couldn't make a shift, either technologically or politically, to a new one. The last great example, ancient Rome. Not so ancient, less than 2,000 years ago. In the early days, the first few centuries of Rome, they used their military to gain energy. They pillaged every surrounding kingdom. Well, when they got to Gaul, they kind of ran out. They did the Middle East, they got Egypt, they got Gaul. Finally, they had no more to pillage. So they had to find another way to gain energy. They had 1 million slaves they had to feed in Rome. They had a huge bureaucracy. They had a military establishment garrisoned over Europe. And they had an aristocracy all on the public dole. So what did they do? They went to cereal plants, the great energy store. Stored energy in the cereal plant. The surplus grain became the energy. But it wasn't enough, so they kept taxing the soil and taxing the soil. And they didn't lay it fallow. And they kept overusing it and overusing it. Boom. The soil went. The countryside was depopulated by the 4th and 5th century. They could not keep the energy yield thermodynamically up. Well before the hordes were at the front gates, their energy regime based on cereal grains had collapsed. And remember, the next time you go to Rome, beautiful city, there were 1.5 million people in that city in the 4th century. In the 7th century, there were 40,000 people living in rubble. So the key question before the energy industry and the power and utility industry and the software and telecom industry, the business community and the public, can we make a shift in a thoughtful way from an energy era based on fossil fuels to one based on renewables and hydrogen, and how do we go about it? All right. We get our fuel cell from General Electric. I guess they're going into nationwide distribution this year, or Ballard or some other company. Then you generate your own electricity. You're your own power plant. At the factory, your industrial site, your residence, your commercial office. Surplus electricity, you send back to the grid. We'll get to the grid in a minute. Right now, a couple of companies here and there are going for premium power in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. They want backup. The name of the game is liquidity. Utilities have lost 1/3 of their equity since the stock market burst. The big hits were telecom and utilities. So a lot of companies I work with don't trust that the power company in California or elsewhere is going to provide them with enough electricity during peak load, and they don't want their manufacturing line to go down. Sound familiar? So they're starting with Sterling, and they're moving to fuel cells for backup. And the first few are beginning to set up mini grids in industrial parks. Pretty soon the backup will be the central source. Home use, I don't think GE is right in banking on home use unless two things happen. A really volatile situation in the Middle East shoots oil up and stays up at 55 or 60 a barrel for a long time, and that's politics. It could happen. It's a wild card. Or the utility companies are so broke and they have so little liquidity that they can't reach your needs for electricity, and you don't want to have brownouts in residential areas for long periods of time. Then you're going to rush out and get that GE power cell. GE is not stupid. They're a smart company. But I don't think it's going to happen tomorrow morning. Portables. You're going to see hydrogen fuel cell cartridges before the end of the decade. Motorola's working on theirs. I had lunch with the CEO of Nokia and his staff a month ago and did a seminar with them. They're a little behind. They think by the end of the decade, you'll be able to take a hydrogen fuel cell cartridge and power up your cell phone for 40 days or your laptop. The public will love it. Automobiles. All right, the industry spent $2 billion, more than that now, on a fuel cell, hydrogen-powered car. Most of us in the environmental community, my friends said, this is a trick. These car companies are tricking us. They are tricking us. They're talking about this fantasy hydrogen future way off in the distant horizon. You know why they're doing this? They don't want to deal with CAFE standards and fuel efficiencies and the Kyoto protocols. So they're tricking us. Let me say $2 billion is not a trick. On the other hand, I believe the environmental community is correct that it wasn't front burner, it wasn't serious until last year, and what changed this equation is the state of California, as you know. Grassroots movement, forcing the state legislature to pass a bill, forcing Governor Gray Davis to sign it, saying if you want to sell a car in the state of California in the year 2009, you got to have zero emissions. General Motors and all the car companies have sued the state of California. And unfortunately, sadly, the White House has joined the suit. That's not visionary. On the other hand, if you were a fly on the wall in the corporate boardroom of General Motors with Mr. Wagoner or with Bill Ford at the Ford Motor Company or Honda or Toyota or BMW, they're desperately racing to get there, to get those fuel cell cars, because if they lose in the courts and California doesn't continue to cave politically, you can't lose California. It's the biggest automobile market in the whole world. It's the 5th largest economy. How many of you saw Dan Rather's interview on 60 Minutes with Mr. Wagoner 3 weeks ago? I helped them prepare that. Well, that was pretty interesting, wasn't it? He said, how much are you spending on this car? He said, $100 million a year. We've spent $1 billion. He said, isn't this your career at stake? He said, this is my career. How big a stake is it? Have you seen how many have actually seen the General Motors high-wire car? It is amazing, is it not? I actually thought Bill Ford would be the first to do this, but General Motors, it's interesting. Bill Ford did a mea culpa speech last year, remember? He said, we've all lost our love affair with the car. His granddaddy must be turning in his grave. Well, Mr. Wagoner has given us the new love affair, the high wire. Parenthetically, this car was designed in 6 months in Europe. Propulsion was done in Castelmaines. The Italians did the design, and the Italians and Swedes did the software. This isn't like any car you've ever seen. All glass, incredible legroom, accelerates like an internal combustion engine, 200-mile radius. All you get is, with the hydrogen is pure water and heat, but that's the beginning. What General Motors is selling is not a car. And this is what everyone in the industry has to understand, the energy and power industry. They're selling you a power plant on wheels. When they 60 Minutes rolled it out, they rolled out 4 wheels and a slick-looking thin skateboard between them. You pay for a power plant, or you lease it for 20 years. Then you can snap on whatever car you want. It's modular. You can snap on an SUV this week, a convertible the next week, a station wagon the third week. No steering wheel. Dan Rather got behind what it was, but it wasn't a steering wheel, and he had no brakes, and there were no pedals, and there's no engine, and there's no noise. It's a joystick. It's all by wire. It is a dot-com car for the dot-com generation. Now, as my wife said, I'll never, ever be able to figure out how to run this car. At my age, she's trying to get me off our clutch and back to the automatic. But every one of your kids, your 10-year-old kids, will get right behind this joystick, and they're going to take it right out of the driveway. It's a revolution. But here's what's so interesting about this car. What's interesting is when you're not driving it. This is a power plant. It's analogous to a personal computer. If 25% of the cars, when they're not being used, are plugged back into the grid, because you don't use the car most of the day, and let's say the cost of the hydrogen is cheaper than the cost of the electricity at a given point, you're going to sell it back. 25% of the cars in North America are connected back to the power grid. You can eliminate every single power plant in all of North America. You have to think of this like every computer connected. This is every fuel cell connected. Now, we have to imagine hundreds, then thousands of adapters, then millions of adapters in homes, industrial sites, autos, and factories connecting. They're using electricity that they're generating. The surplus goes back to the grid. The HPs, the Microsofts, they're going to have to reconfigure the power grids using the same hardware and software that we used on the web, so they're smart and decentralized, so you can send your electricity peer-to-peer, decentralized to whoever you choose in real time. The Electric Power Research Institute has its first software in place called FACS. We're just at the beginning of this revolution. This great convergence between the software telecom communication revolution and distributed generation of hydrogen, with nanotechnology providing a lot of the infrastructure down the line and material development, third industrial revolution. It will change everything because power always changes everything. If you know thermodynamically how a civilization uses the energy of the planet and how it distributes and set it up, you know the whole question of political and social power. It's It's all about who controls energy. But this energy is bottom up. What happens when everyone generates their own energy? It's got to change the dynamic. Remember, when we went to coal, steam, and rail, that first industrial revolution, it changed all of the politics of the world. We went from city-state to nation-states. We went from local markets to national markets. We went from feudal economies to capitalist market economies. We went from monarchies to democratic republics. And it quickened when we went to the second industrial revolution. What happens when we come up with decentralized distributed generation of energy? Well, PricewaterhouseCoopers, by the way, has just done a study a year and a half ago. They're projecting a $1.7 trillion industry in 17 years, which should get our attention. Who's going to control all this? See, that's what interests me. We're in the beginning of a great revolution. It would be like if we were in the room just before Watt and we said, hey, who's going to control the first industrial revolution? Or Daimler and Benz, and we're in the room with them. Who's going to control the second industrial revolution? Who's going to control the third industrial revolution? It's going to be, I think, a struggle similar to the web, because we're talking about decentralized energy just like decentralized communication. This is something new for human beings, because we're used to centralizing from the ancient agricultural civilizations of Iraq all the way to the modern era, centralizing energy. Now, there have been some periods where you have loose agriculture, it's decentralized, but a lot of the great civilizations are all based on centralizing energy. Every great civilization has been based on centralizing energy. So, we had a struggle on the web. Remember when the early adopters in this technology started putting their computers together, when ARPANET turned into the National Science Foundation Net and then the Internet, and the early adapters said, information's going to run free, this is a revolution, we're all going to share, this is going to be a commons. Perry Barlow from the Grateful Dead and Esther Dyson and my old friend Nick Negroponte at MIT, they said this is going to be a shared commons. Well, what happened is Microsoft came along and said, we like this is a great idea, but we'd like you to use our window. Then AOL came along and said, we're on the same page, this is a great revolution, but we'd like you to pay an access fee in return for services, and we'll get you up into cyberspace. This struggle between who controls decentralized communication is not over. At one point, all the critics said, oh, the big companies are taking this over. Microsoft may look powerful, but who's coming on real quick, scaring the pizzazz out of them? Linux, open source, free code. Front cover Business Week 3 weeks ago. Across Europe, it's being adapted. Across the United States, it's all free. If you look at the curves, Microsoft is plateaued. Linux is just moving dramatically. Now, the big content companies, they're all intent on saving copyright. And they're putting in all this encryption technology and working with the government. There's only one problem with this. Your kids. Now, how many of you have kids from the ages of 9 to 16 still at home? All the tired ones here. All right. See, they barely could get rings on the... Now, do an experiment, although this is a little dangerous. Knock on your kid's door after school and see if he or she will let you in the bedroom. Then check out what they're doing on the screen. What are they doing? They're downloading and file sharing. They're getting CDs and music and film and everything free. The companies call it cheating. They call it sharing. They're in the commons. The company said that they're violating the law. Now, if you were going to bet on the content companies protecting copyright with encryption, or millions and millions and millions of little kids who have nothing else to do after school but figure a way around it, who do you think is going to win this battle? It's the power of decentralization. The power of decentralization. So when we get to energy, the struggle is going to be even more significant because it's basic to survival. On the one hand, I congratulate Dutch Shell and BP. I know they're here today. They're 8 years ahead of the curve. Mr. Brown at BP has got a fire under him about the renewable hydrogen future. He's actually changed his moniker. It's really postmodern. BP, Beyond Petroleum. And Mr. Watt at Dutch Shell, they're in a race. Their scenario units are good. They understand that we're moving toward a peak in the next half century on oil. For the last 8 years, they've been buying up renewable technologies that have worth their weight in salt, all the startup companies, and they've been patenting and licensing. They got huge hydrogen divisions. And they're both projecting figures that are fairly similar to the analysis in my book. They're saying by mid-century, maybe a third, maybe even as much as a half of our energy will be renewable-based with hydrogen storage carrier. Oil will still be here, gas will still be here, coal will still be here, sure. But around 2050, renewables, and hydrogen just basically barely subsume, for the first time in history, oil, coal, and gas. By the end of the century, fossil fuels are boutique. We use them for what we need to use them for, but maybe not for power, heat, and light. On the other hand, I'm worried about Dutch Shell and BP. They got the license, they got the patents, they got the control. Do they want to control all of this renewable technology and hydrogen from the top down? Or are they going to face new contenders like Microsoft faced with Linux? On the other hand, you've got the power companies. Now, I work with a couple of the largest power companies in the United States, one of the top 4, actually. And can I tell you what their thoughts are, the leadership? It's very, very interesting. Early on, when 30 states passed legislation saying if you have a renewable technology like wind or solar and you generate your own electricity at home, we'll let you sell it back to the grid. I don't know if Texas does that, but 30 states allow you to take it back to the grid. The power companies couldn't have cared less about this. This is for the environmentalists. We'll give them a little thing. It's irrelevant to us. And they actually really didn't care about it. Then after a few years, they started thinking, gee, what happens if all these people actually eventually do this and generate their own electricity? What do we do? Bring back Enron. No. What do we do? Well, in the last few years, the companies that I work with have had second thoughts about fuel cells. And the reason is liquidity. Again, U.S. companies, like companies around the world, U.S. have lost 1/3 of their equity in the last 2 years. The investment community is not looking their way. They're building gas-fired power plants, but those are even expensive. They're now starting to see, as fuel cell development becomes more attractive, it's modular, as you know. It's easier to put a fuel cell at the industrial site than to build a new gas-fired power plant. But, and here's the big but, they want to control the fuel cells. When I work them through workshops, the senior leadership, here's what they say. Hey, you don't have to buy your fuel cell from General Electric. We'll put the fuel cell at your industrial site or residence. We'll just put it in there. You just pay for 30 days of access. I wrote a book, The Age of Access. In networks, the property always stays with the producer. It's never alienated to the consumer. Instead, you access through membership, subscriptions, leases, licensing agreements. You pay for the time you experience the good or service. You don't pay for the acquisition of it. You with me? So they're right into networks, not markets, pure networks. They say, we'll keep the fuel cell. We'll put it there. We'll give you 30 days of power. The software will send the excess electricity back to the grid, and we'll give you a discount. Very neat. What I say to them is, you're naive if you believe that you're going to be able to control this, just like I think Microsoft was naive and Disney and AOL were naive on copyright. The fact is, it isn't going to happen that way. This is too decentralized. The technology is too decentralized. Let's say that you're a real estate developer building a common interest development outside of Houston. You're going to build 1,000 residential units, all right? Or you're building an industrial park out here in the suburbs. What you're going to do is you're going to go to the power companies and you're going to be competitive. You'll go to a number of them and you'll say, look, I'll tell you what you do. We're building this residential common interest development or industrial park. You put in the infrastructure, you power company, you put in the fuel cells, you put in the infrastructure, then we'll give you a 30-year contract. We'll sell you back the electricity for 30 years with a renewable clause. If you don't like it, we'll go to another power company. Why wouldn't the end users organize? In Europe, the producer cooperatives are already organizing to buy the fuel cells for their members. And producer cooperatives are huge in Europe and in Japan. What you're going to begin to see is the unfolding of a great power struggle. Top down, bottom up, somewhere in between like the web. It can be win-win. There's room for everyone here. Let the big energy companies like Dutch Shell and BP, they know energy. Let them do what they do best. Let them help develop renewable technologies and work on fuel cell technologies and make the transition to natural gas, which is essential transition, and then into the new technologies. That's what they do best, as long as they don't control the whole operation. Let the HPs reconfigure the power grid and the Microsofts do the software so that they're smart and decentralized so you can move energy peer-to-peer. Let the utility companies run these decentralized grids because that's what they do best, but make damn sure the end users, whether you're a commercial shopping mall or an industrial park or a residential area, that you and I control the energy we generate so we have a reciprocal relationship. A reciprocal relationship. Now, let me say, I think the great beneficiaries of this revolution will be the third world. They just got to get off oil. They're going deeper in the cellar, deeper and deeper in debt. Can you imagine the third world ever getting out of debt as we move toward peak in oil? It's getting desperate. They can leapfrog. The good news is they don't have enough infrastructure to worry about in some of these places. The reason people are powerless is literal. They don't have any power. 65% of the human race this afternoon has never made a single telephone call. 1/3 of the human race, it was put up there on the screen an hour ago, 1/3 of the human race has absolutely zero access to electricity and commercial energy. If you're looking for dung or firewood for 4 hours a day to heat the rice for the family meal, you're not a player. Universal access to electricity ought to be the rallying cry for everyone in the developing world in the 21st century, meaning leverage your credit. Instead of being a renter of oil, which you can't afford, and you have nothing to save for self-sufficiency after you've used it, leverage your credit. So as companies here in Houston and in Detroit and Silicon Valley, as you make these technologies cheaper, fuel cells, let me talk about the fuel cell technology for a minute. Remember I said one bell curve is oil and gas is going up? I forgot to mention the other bell curve, and that's the bell curve for renewables and hydrogen. It's going down. Moore's law has set in with some of the technology. We're doubling the knowledge and halving the cost every 18 months as we did in software and biotech. That's point one. 2, as we adopt economies of scale, the price goes down for renewables and hydrogen. 3, fuel cells are 2.5 times more efficient than the internal combustion engine. And 4, you people, the engineers, the scientists, the researchers, you're going to make these materials and these technologies cheaper and cheaper, like cell phones and personal computers. That's your mission. So you're going to see 2 bell curves. Oil and gas is going up. The cost of renewables to extract hydrogen is going down. As they approach each other, we begin to see the possibilities of an enormous acceleration to a new energy era. But this can't be done without a public-private partnership, and every researcher in this room knows this. There's never been a transition in history of energy regimes without the mobilization of the public sphere. From ancient Sumer to the early republic here in the United States when we laid down rail. Sure, we had the British investment in rail, but we had to have a public investment with the land as well. And if it hadn't been for Dwight Eisenhower, we could not have taken advantage of the second half of the internal combustion revolution. Remember when he signed that Defense Highway Act, was it 1954? That was the biggest public works project in history. We laid down the infrastructure for the highway so we could finally, if you will, close on the second half of the internal combustion engine. The marketplace would not have built the interstate highway system. So what's critical to all your discussion this weekend here is a public-private partnership. But in the third world, let them leverage their microcredit to get renewable technologies into their villages and into their urban areas. Solar and photovoltaics across the roofs in Sao Paulo and Rio. Wind power, geothermal, hydro. Get the fuel cells, create the mini-grids, generate electricity. Then something really interesting happens. Once you have electricity, you're a player. Then we can have stage 2. Stage 2. Stage 1 was globalization from the top down. It failed. It was based on fossil fuels. It could never have exceeded. Because fossil fuels by their nature, and you know this better than the rest of us, it had to be top down in its command and control. Coal, oil, and gas aren't found everywhere. It's not ubiquitous. So you have to have big military political establishment to get it. Then you have to have huge investment capital to process coal, oil, and gas. So we end up with a few dozen energy companies and 400 or 500 corporations running the world by the second half of the 20th century. The reason globalization and fossil fuels failed, and it didn't fail for everybody, it didn't fail for us, and I want to tell you where I come from. I come out of a family who made its whole livelihood from fossil fuels. My dad was the 3rd converter of polyethylene into plastic bags in the United States after World War II. So I have an affinity for this industry, even though I'm telling you we got a problem here and we got to make the shift, and the experts are here to do it. All right? So what we have here is the third world has to leverage this, and if you have electricity, then you can produce locally and sell globally. The reason globalization from the top down failed, it wasn't dense enough. It was too narrow a band. Everybody wasn't participating in the exchange. And so if you have a few enjoying the largesse and the rest aren't participating, you're going to have too much volatility and not enough social trust to create globalization. In order to break down borders and barriers and eliminate tariffs and have flexible labor, you have to have something first. Social capital always precedes market capital in development. The market doesn't precede the culture. The social capital and culture precedes the market, meaning If you don't have social trust, you can't do any of this. Because you break down barriers, people have to trust each other to get into market relationships. How many of you think trust is building in the world? Social trust. 1. I have to talk to your therapist later. This man's but you understand what I'm saying. So, in order to build trust, we have to have reglobalization from the bottom up, meaning access to electricity, renewable and hydrogen, so you can generate local production and sell globally. The model is Italy. It's the only G7 country that I would use as a model, because it's the number 6 economy in the world, 60 million people, very powerful. But if you've spent much time with industry there, as I have, SMEs from Rome North, little small and medium-sized enterprises in Tuscany and Perugia, you've been there. And then they have little operations. They join in confederations and producer cooperatives, so they have power, economies of scale. They sell to the world. Small production units, big confederations and cooperatives. If 60 million people in Italy can be the 5th or 6th largest economic power in the world with SMEs, why can't everybody else if they have electricity? Then we have deep reglobalization, everyone participating. Finally, let me talk about Europe, the U.S., the politics of Houston. There's a game unfolding here. It's a great game. It's a new great game on hydrogen, but I want to share with you what I know about this game at this point. Because I actually believe, as one of the speakers said at 1 o'clock, the first speaker, I'm sorry I didn't get his name, on entrepreneurialism in Houston, what's interesting here is Houston can be the center for this. You have the energy industry here, and what's more, you have the chemistry industry here. You've got deep, deep expertise here to be the center of what this new revolution is all about. It's important to know what's going on politically. First, Europe. I serve as a personal advisor to Romano Prodi. He's the president of the European Commission, the governing body of the European Union. Last March, I presented him with a strategic white paper, long, on how the European Union could wean itself off of oil dependency over a period of 3 to 4 decades and become the first fully integrated, hydrogen-based, renewable-based superpower of the 21st century. They've got to get off oil. They're totally dependent on the Middle East. He and I spent personal time on this, and he gave the green light. This was in May. In October, we announced the game plan. You probably read it on the front page of the business section of the New York Times. That's how quick this moved. And if you know the EU, it does not move quick. Mr. Prodi has invested himself personally. We put together a coalition, a partnership, a seamless partnership between European companies like Daimler, Chrysler, British Petroleum, and the EU to set up a roadmap, government-private partnership, to move step by step in every area from research and development to new regulatory regimes to move this to a new energy regime. When he made the announcement in the New York Times interview, Mr. Prodi said 3 things. One, he said, this is the next step after the euro. This is the next step in Europe. We centralize currency, now we're going to decentralize energy. If you know anything about Mr. Prodi, history professor, Talmudic, very Aristotelian. Sometimes people think he takes too much time, but he's a man of balance. Centralize the currency, decentralize the energy for Europe. Then he said, this will be to Europe, and listen to this, Houston, this will be to Europe what the high-tech space program was to the U.S. Your multiplier effect, the high-tech economy of the last decade of the 20th century. Now we're going to be the first renewable economy of the hydrogen age. He's mindful of history. He knows that England became the world's great power in the 19th century because it was the first to harness its coal reserves with steam power. He's mindful that the U.S. became the great economy in the world because it was first to harness its vast oil reserves with the Daimler-Benz internal combustion engine. The EU is on the move. They're going to put 10 new countries in on May 1st and a constitution in place. 450 million people, 3rd largest political unit in the world, a constitution in place May 1st of next year. They're now the largest exporting market, and their GDP equals ours. They're soft power because they don't have military, but do not discount the European Union. It's not just a trading unit anymore. And then he said, the reason we'll prevail in Europe is we know how to create public-private partnerships. We're comfortable with it. And of course, all my friends thought Boeing, Airbus. Airbus was a public-private partnership. They've now taken over. They're #1 in the world. And Europe can do it because most of the top 10 banks and the Fortune 500 companies, they're European. They may be behind in some industries, but in investment, that's not so. They're up there. Now, here's what happened after that announcement was made. American companies like Westinghouse and 3M, they had put together a coalition asking the White House for a $5.5 billion partnership over 10 years, which is a very small amount of money. They hadn't heard from the White House. Spencer Abraham at the Department of Energy, to his credit, he's on fire about hydrogen, but I'm going to talk to you about the differences between his program and the European one. But he has a roadmap, but they haven't operationalized it. They don't have a business-government partnership. Now, why did President Bush say the magic word hydrogen in his State of the Union address? Did it not surprise you? It came out of nowhere. So many people around the country went like that, and they went to the dictionary. Is that like what you put in balloons for the kids in the party? Is that hydrogen? Or the old people said, oh, the Hindenburg, it'll never work.
Those are very old people.
Very old people. Well, I remember, I'm turning 60. I remember seeing that film. Oh, the humanity of it. Boom. So what's happened is there's tremendous pressure. It's a little bit like a slow fuse Sputnik. Remember when Sputnik went up, all you older folks? We were in school, and we walked into class one day, and the teacher said, put down the English book, put down the history book, put down the music, pick up the science book, pick up the math book, and then go out tonight and look in the sky. They're there. Had lights going across the sky. We spent 30 years. It was Cold War. We mobilized the society. The real benefit is that terrible system of command socialism finally collapsed, but it collapsed primarily internally, not because we did much to bear about it, but we created a high-tech economy as a result. All right? So now we're starting to think, my God, are the Europeans going to get ahead of us here? So President Bush mentioned hydrogen, but here's what I want you to leave this today with. When you look at his budget, he's asked for $1.7 billion. It's nothing. This isn't like the partnership that Dwight Eisenhower gave us, a $350 billion public works project to finally close on the internal combustion engine. $1.7 billion. But then it gets worse. When you actually look at the budget he sent to Congress, much of the money is to foster the interests of the old fossil fuel and nuclear industries. That is money to see if we can't spend $1 billion to gasify coal to get hydrogen and then find a way to sequester the CO2. Then money to the natural gas and oil industry to sequester hydrogen, and then the nuclear industry. Very little to renewables. Now, don't get me wrong. The European Union tack is that you need fossil fuels, but we have to have on 3 tracks at once. You can't put all your marbles in the old basket. In other words, fossil fuels are going to be here. They're going to be here to mid-century as the dominant role. They're going to be here to the end of the century as they wind down. So the European track is 3 tracks. 1, use existing fossil fuels. Do the appropriate underwriting so that natural gas is helped, because it's a transition strategy. And the 3rd track, deep underwriting of renewable energy technologies to extract hydrogen, so you're in 3 tracks at once. Tough CAFE standards and fuel efficiency, use the fossil fuels. 2, go to natural gas as a short-term transition. 3, heavy underwriting of renewables to extract hydrogen from water, so that by 2020, you've got the beginnings of a renewable hydrogen infrastructure in place. Does this make sense? So you go on all 3 tracks. So it's not a matter that we don't provide money for the old industries, but if you're only on track 1, then hydrogen becomes a Trojan horse to support an old energy era. President Bush seems to want to bring us into a new energy regime, hydrogen, without leaving the old energy past. You can't have it both ways. So here's where I think we stand on this. What's key are the people like yourself in this room. You're the engineers, you're the scientists, you're the academicians, you're the folks in the energy industry, and you're right here in Houston. This is your moment to help create a legacy for us, to help create a legacy for the rest of us. You have the expertise to do this. You're here this weekend because you want to begin to think of new ways to use nanotechnologies and renewables and hydrogen to get us into a new energy era. You know, one of the things that I've learned after years of being with the Advanced Management Program at Wharton is about legacies, because we bring in men and women who are around 40 because they're being picked for CEO. Then we bring them back in at 50 for a refresher. And one of the things I've noticed over the years, this is very bizarre, right around 40, when we bring them into our A&P program, they're having second doubts, all these men and women. They're just being picked. They've made it. They're starting to have an identity crisis. And I see it's even worse at 50. The good news is once they're 60, you don't even remember what your identity is, so there is some saving grace. But what I've seen is so many of them late at night, sweat under the neck, looking up at the ceiling, the spouse turns to them and they say, Is it me? No. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's a crisis. You go out into the desert. Some of my friends have never returned. They're living somewhere else. But when we return, this is really serious. I've seen this over and over at 40 and 50. For professionals, so much of our identity is our avocation. It's what we do. Remember, most working people don't identify with their job on the assembly line or in a white-collar job. It's what they do afterward. For most of us, as professionals, our work is our avocation. It's our identity. So many of my friends that we've brought through these courses, they have an identity crisis around 40 because half their adult life's over, and they say, is this all I am? I'm an engineer. That's it. I teach here at Rice University. That's it. I have an entrepreneurial startup company. That's it. What happens when people come back from the desert is the first 20 years you say, what can I do to get ahead for myself and my family? The next 20 years we say, what can we leave behind? Does this make sense? We want to believe we've got something that our skills are important for beyond just the bottom line. There's an enormous opportunity here for the people in this community in Houston, the university community, the energy industry, to make a difference for the rest of us. Help bring us onto this hydrogen page. Help think creatively on how to use the nanotechnologies for us, as you are, and fuel cell technologies and renewable energy technologies. And what will be the result of this legacy? The result is the best technology expertise in the world is in this country. A lot of it's in this city. What you can help us do is move on to that roadmap so that we're clear. We have a tremendous public-private partnership. Don't push for the peanuts, a couple of $1 billion. What we want is a massive, massive public-private partnership at the local, state, and federal level, worthy of the next generation, underwriting the next revolution, comparable to the space program, comparable to the U.S. Highway Act. Anything less than that, we're selling ourselves short in terms of our role in the next period of history in the 21st century. So get us on the roadmap, and then what do? We radically reduce global warming. We get off the carbons. We get onto the hydrogen. 2, we narrow the divide between the haves and have-nots. You give us the technology and make it cheap enough as we adapt it so that everyone can have access to electricity and be a player and produce locally and sell globally so we can have deep reglobalization. 3, help us diffuse the geopolitics in the Middle East. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. We don't want our young men and women in harm's way, and we don't want all the people in the Persian Gulf in harm's way. We've got to reduce that load, that burden on Middle East oil. And finally, in the business community, we've got to have predictability. We can't keep holding our breath every year or two because there's a crisis in oil, because we can't plan for the future generation. So this could be the third great revolution. I do believe it's the next period in economic history. I am not sure how we'll get there. Really, it's up to you to help us do it. And if you can bring together all this tremendous expertise that you have gained in the energy industry over all these years, you can help create a legacy that will be worthy and create a new moment for our generations to come in the 21st and 22nd century. It's the best single thing you could do for us. Good afternoon. You've been very patient. You know, my wife always says, the older you get, the longer you are talking. But you've been very patient, so I appreciate it. These are not easy things.
You drew several analogies between distributed computing, the internet, and power grids. And what strikes me as one of the fundamental differences is electric power grids have to, the generation and the load has to be balanced in real time. It kind of implies to me a whole new, the vision that you're advocating for distributed generation on that scale implies to me something like packet switching electric power. How do you do that?
Well, I think that's the key for the HPs of the world. I know that the Electric Power Research Institute, for example, and I mentioned this in the book, they have a software program in place now, FACTS, which they're beginning, where they can send measured packets of energy to where they want on the grid, just beginning that process. I think the technology's there. What we now need to have are the strategic alliances between the software, telecom, and communication industry and the fuel cell, power, utility, and energy industries. We've got to begin to create these strategic alliances to help make this happen. Use NASA as an approach, that team approach. Bring all the disciplines together. That's what makes it so powerful. Imagine the ability of doing what you just were talking about doing. That's what I'm talking about, decentralizing that power grid. So you can move it just like information, peer-to-peer. And it won't happen overnight. When I say to business leaders, don't ask me about a killer app. I don't want to hear about it. You have to be a cartographer here, an entrepreneurial cartographer. There's no short fix here or magic bullet. You're going to have to think short-term, medium-term, long-term strategy, and as an entrepreneurial cartographer, figure out the puzzle. We want an entire infrastructure for a third industrial revolution. So when you make your investments, whether it be in a fuel cell company or a nanotechnology company or a computer software, find out how they're starting to intersect and find out those companies that are the most likely to converge. You with me? Then make your investments short, medium, long-term based on that protocol.
Very much enjoyed your lecture. Could you clear up one question for me? You spoke a lot about distributed generation of power using fuel cells and hydrogen. But what I'm confused about, though, is the location in which the hydrogen, as you mentioned, which is the energy carrier, where is that generated? And is that really distributed, or will that be the linchpin of this?
That's a question that's really controversial right now. I'll give you an example, the European Union. But you could use the same example. We just had this problem in Canada. As some places will be better served with renewable energy than others. Some places have sun, some don't. Some have wind, like our prairie states have wind, but you don't have in other parts of the states. Geothermal will be in some places, but not others. Biomass is everywhere if we can get direct sunlight with biomass. So there's going to be a struggle between centralized generation of this and decentralized. My bias is to subsidize as best we can to get as much subsidized energy as we can with the sun, through wind, solar, photovoltaics, geothermal, hydro, biomass. But I'm also a realist and understand there will be some occasions where, for example, off the coast of Europe, we're saying those wind farms off the Atlantic coast can provide a hell of a lot of energy for the Nordic countries in Germany and elsewhere. So we know that. But that's going to be centralized. But if the end user owns their fuel cell, at least, then they can be a reciprocal partner. So if you're an industrial site or you're a producer cooperative and you own those fuel cells, the electricity, the hydrogen's coming into you, maybe from a centralized source, but you're generating the electricity. And if you own and control those fuel cells, you can still be part of the partnership, even though the hydrogen's centralized. My druthers is to find every way we can to encourage the most decentralized generation of the hydrogen, knowing it may not be available everywhere.
Could you provide a little bit more information about this public-private partnership that you have in mind? All you said is that you wanted it to be big.
Well, we've actually laid out a roadmap that was part of the strategic memorandum that I put together for Mr. Prouty. We have have the operational map. I've just critiqued the first draft, and what we're going to be doing is, and it's a map on how to do it at the beginning. You know it. This is just the beginning. We're going to hold a summit on June 16th in Brussels. I'll be keynoting with Mr. Prouty and the environmental minister and research and energy minister. Mr. Abraham will be there. He'll give a speech just before I lay out the vision. So he's going to be there. He's going to lay out the Bush White House vision of this. There is going to be some cooperation between, that's why he's coming. Mr. Prouty met with Mr. Abraham a month ago, and Mr. Abraham wants a worldwide effort, but he's very interested in getting cooperation on coal and nuclear. While Europe does not have a problem with cooperating on fossil fuels, doesn't have a problem with that, Europe is bent toward renewables for one reason, and this has to do with a different roadmap. 22% of the electricity in the EU, as you know, has to be renewable in 7 years from now. That's our target. That's a done deal. It's the most aggressive target in the world. Only California has a target which is half that 10 years later. And 12% of all the energy in the EU has to be renewable in 7 years. So we have no choice but to move toward hydrogen as a storage carrier for renewables, and we have to move that technology. So there could be cooperation if the United States wants a roadmap that includes hydrogen extraction from fossil fuels. Sure, short-term cooperation because we're going to be using fossil fuels in Europe too. But there also has to be cooperation on the other side, if you follow me, to help in the development of renewables. Now, Spencer Abraham, to his credit, said eventually we want to get to renewables, but he's not walking the walk, being honest with you. I think he's really pioneering. I don't know how how intimate President Bush is on it, although he's talking about it a lot. But they're not in all three tracks. I don't want to see my country just staying in track one. So we've got a roadmap that's being laid out on June 16th in Brussels at the first global summit on hydrogen. And we'll see. And we've ponied up 2 billion euros to get it started, which is already more than we have here. But, you know, a lot of these things have to do with politics. I went to the Senate Democratic leadership. I came in and talked to them. And they said, would you put a memorandum together similar to the one in the EU, which I did. They circulated. We had a luncheon briefing with the key Democratic senators about 6 weeks ago. But what happened, among other things, is the Democrats, I said, take the fuel cell coalition. They're asking for $5.5 billion. I said, put it into the bill. We did. So the result is, if you look at the Senate bill that's coming to the floor, they took the advice. They went to the fuel cell coalition. Senator Dorgan said, let's put in $5.5 or $6 billion. He's the head of the Democratic Senate Policy Committee on the Energy Committee. We compromised out. The Republicans said, well, that's too much. We got $3 billion now. That's twice what President Bush asked for. That was all done in 4 weeks. That's in the Senate markup bill. This is serious stuff. But $3 billion to me is not much. But, yeah, the beginnings of roadmap are there. Yeah.
What is your best path towards making electricity cheaper than hydrogen? And if it is renewable, how would you rank them in importance order?
How would I rank what?
The renewables.
You mean in which one's the most important? Well, wind now is obviously the most competitive for generating electricity once. All right? Hydro is competitive in many parts of the world. Geothermal is not. Solar and photovoltaic is getting there, but it's not quite there yet. That's where we're at this point. In terms of the electricity, we got a problem. Renewables are expensive because you generate electricity twice for those fuel cells. My belief is, in talking to enough people in this industry, in the fuel cell industry and hydrogen, and those that are working on this, the auto industry, we will be able to get those curves to approach each other. I know oil and gas curves are going to continue to go up, direct and indirect costs. We all know it. There'll be ebbs and flows, but it's going up. And I know that the cost of renewable technologies that Moore's Law is setting in, it's going to go down. You're going to make it go down. And we know economies of scale are going to make it go down, and we know the fuel cell's 2.5 times more efficient. I think we got a road to go till we get there. In the meantime, we have to have deep subsidies. Remember, the government deeply subsidized the oil industry, deeply subsidized the coal industry, deeply subsidized the nuclear industry. Why should renewables be the orphan? Why all of a sudden should we say no? So what I'm hoping is the energy community and those who are in the chemical industry and the utility companies and the software get together with the Fuel Cell Coalition and others and start demanding that we have a real public-private partnership. You can't do it unless the tax dollars are there. I'm willing to have my tax dollars put to you to create something powerful for the rest of us for the 21st century. Good afternoon. Best of fortunes. Enjoyed being here.